So now reading on Trevor's behalf. Public schools in Victoria, as elsewhere in Australia, face a funding crisis. The key aspects of this crisis are: government funding increases have heavily favoured private schools over public schools since 2009. Independent and Catholic schools in Victoria have a large resource advantage over public schools. Public schools are massively underfunded, despite enrolling 80% or more of disadvantaged students, and will remain so into the next decade unless the current funding arrangements are overhauled. By contrast, private schools are overfunded. If Victoria is to truly become an education state, it must fully fund public schools to increase equity in school outcomes. Before I amplify these points, I'd like to set the national context of school funding. Victoria's public school system is the worst resourced in Australia. Total income per student was $15,970 in 2021, compared with the average for Australia of $16,739 and $16,887 in New South Wales. Victoria also has the largest resource gap between public and independent schools in Australia at $10,461 per student. The resource gap between public and Catholic schools is $2,792 per student. It's the third largest in Australia. Victoria is the third most under-resourced public school system in Australia after the Northern Territory and Queensland. They are funded at only 85.9% of their schooling resource standard, referred to as the SRS, just ahead of Queensland at 84.9%, while Northern Territory public schools are funded at only 76.6% of their SRS. That's the chart I should have had up before, but apologies for that. So we now move on to the second chart. The average funding share for public schools across Australia is 87.3%. Growth in government funding, Commonwealth and state per student in Catholic and independent schools in Victoria has been double the growth in funding of public schools between 2009 and 2021. Funding, adjusted for inflation, for Catholic and independent schools increased by over $1,000 per student more than for public schools. Funding for public schools increased by $1,484 per student compared to $2,800 per student in Catholic schools and by $2,500 in independent schools. Funding for public schools increased by 15.7% compared to 38.2% for Catholic schools and 30.4% for independent schools. Commonwealth government funding for Catholic schools increased by over 4 times its funding for public schools, and the increase for independent schools was nearly 4 times that for public schools. Commonwealth funding for public schools increased by only $561 per student, adjusted for inflation, compared to $2,377 for independent schools and $2,145 for independent schools. Victorian government funding for public schools increased by $923 per student, adjusted for inflation, between 2009 and 2021. $423 per Catholic student and by $355 per independent school student. However, these figures obscure a significant change within that period. The previous Liberal government cut funding for public schools by $939 per student between 2011 and 2014. It also cut funding for Catholic schools by $125 per student and for independent schools by $67 per student. The Andrews government more than offset these cuts by increasing funding for public schools by $1,607 per student between 2014 and 2021, $163 per Catholic student and $221 per independent student. Income from fees and other sources in public schools fell by $294 per student, adjusted for inflation, compared to an increase of $529 in Catholic schools. Income from these sources fell by $61 per student in independent schools. Income from fees, etc., was significantly affected by COVID in 2020. This income for public schools was reasonably stable between 2009 and 2019 at around $900 to $1,000 per student in current dollars, but it fell by $357 per student in 2020, a reduction of 33%. There was only a slight increase of $34 per student in 2021. The reduction in Catholic schools was only $169 per student, or 3%, and has since recovered to above the 2019 level. There was a substantial fall in fee and other income in independent schools of $1,638 per student, a 10% reduction. However, this reduction in income was fully offset by JobKeeper payments included in Commonwealth recurrent funding, which increased by $2,076 per student in current dollars in 2020, an increase of 26.5%. Fees and other income in independent schools has increased since then. The Australian Taxation Office provided $282 million in JobKeeper payments to just 102 Victorian private schools, nearly all of which went to independent schools. The outcome of these funding changes since 2009 is that Catholic and independent schools have a significant resource advantage over public schools. The income per student in independent schools in 2021 was 69% higher than for public schools, $26,431 per student, compared to $15,970 per student in public schools. Catholic school income per student of $18,762 is nearly 20% higher than in public schools. High levels of government funding have contributed to this resource advantage, especially in the case of Catholic schools. Total government funding for Catholic schools is 91% of total government funding of public school and 71% in the case of independent schools. The ability to charge fees ensures private schools can add to their government funding to ensure their resource advantage over public schools. There are no controls over the extent to which private schools can charge fees while receiving government funding. It is incomprehensible that Commonwealth and Victorian governments ensure that Catholic and independent schools have a large resource advantage over public schools when the latter account for over 80% of disadvantaged students. The resource disparity between private and public schools in Victoria highlights the structural failure of the school funding system. Public schools in Victoria are massively under-resourced. The current bilateral funding agreement between the Commonwealth and Victorian governments authorises massive underfunding of public schools. Public schools are funded at well under their SRS, which is the level of government funding nationally agreed as necessary for schools to meet students' educational needs. Officially, Victorian public schools are funded at 90.4% of their SRS, 20% by the Commonwealth and 70.4% by the Victorian government. However, public schools are actually funded at much less than this because of a special clause in the funding agreement that allows the Victorian government to claim non-school-based expenditures, not officially included in the measure of their SRS, as part of its share of the SRS. Under the agreement, it can claim depreciation and rural school transport expenditure up to 4% of the SRS as part of its share. It can also claim all expenditure on public schools by the Victorian Curriculum and Assessment Authority and the Victorian Registration and Qualifications Authority. This special deal between the Morrison and Andrews governments and all other governments except the ACT effectively reduces the Victorian government share of the SRS to only 65.9% in 2023. Taking account of the Commonwealth share of 20%, public schools are currently funded at 85.9% of their SRS. The funding shortfall is estimated at $1.8 billion this year. A stark inconsistency in the agreement is that there is no provision for the Victorian government to substitute non-school expenditure for an increase in its recurrent funding of private schools. For example, there is no provision for expenditure on the Curriculum and Assessment Authority and the Registration and Qualifications Authority as it relates to private schools to be included as part of the state's share of the SRS of private schools. Private schools get an actual increase in recurrent funding, whereas public schools are defrauded by the inclusion of non-school expenditure items in their SRS. Unless the new bilateral agreement on school funding, to be negotiated between the Commonwealth and Victorian governments next year to apply from 2025, is substantially revised, public schools will remain underfunded indefinitely. The current agreement only requires the Victorian government to fund public schools at 75% of their SRS by 2028. The continuation of the special allowances would mean that public schools would only be funded at 70.5% of their SRS by the Victorian government and at 90.5% by combined Commonwealth and Victorian government funding. In the absence of any change, the cumulative underfunding from 2019 to 2029 is estimated at $19.3 billion. Private schools are overfunded. The resource advantage of private schools is projected to accelerate over the rest of the decade to 2029 under the current arrangements. Commonwealth funding for private schools will increase under special deals provided by the Turnbull and Morrison governments. Under the current funding arrangements, the Commonwealth will fund private schools at 80% of their SRS, and the Victorian government will fund the remaining 20%. However, official figures show that the Commonwealth is funding Victorian private schools at 81.3% of their SRS in 2022, and their funding will remain above 80% until 2028. However, these figures do not include the many special deals for private schools introduced by the Morrison government, such as the $1.2 billion Choice and Accountability Fund, which operates until 2029. This funding boosts the Commonwealth share to 82.9% in 2023 and will only reduce to 80.5% in 2029. The Victorian government is funding private schools at 20% of their SRS. In total, Victorian private schools are funded at 102.9% of their SRS this year and will be overfunded for the rest of the decade, declining slowly to 100.5% in 2029. They are overfunded by $147 million this year, and the cumulative overfunding from 2022 to 2029 is estimated at about $734 million. Victoria is not the education state, as claimed by the Labor government. The Andrews government increased funding for public schools, but they remain a long way from being fully funded. Victoria's school system remains highly inequitable. For example, the latest NAPLAN results show that 56 to 57% of students of parents with low education did not achieve expected levels of proficiency in reading, writing, and numeracy. The corresponding figures for Indigenous students were 55%, 60%, and 62%. There are large achievement gaps between advantaged and disadvantaged students. If Victoria really is to become a successful education state, the Labor government must address the funding failures of the past. Fully funding public schools is a priority because about 80% of low-income students and 84% of Indigenous students in Victoria attend public schools. Numerous studies show that money matters in education, especially for disadvantaged students. The failure to fully fund public schools has huge costs to individuals, society, and the national economy, because it means continuing failure to address disadvantage in education and life. This leads to lower school completion rates, higher unemployment, lower incomes, worse health outcomes, and less access to positions of power and influence in society for disadvantaged students. School funding policies thereby contribute to the social reproduction of inequality in our society. It is an appalling social injustice, but it is also a drag on Australia's economic growth and prosperity. The new Premier, Jacinta Allen, and her Education Minister, Ben Carroll, have much work to do if Victoria is to become a genuine education state. Increasing equity in education is the fundamental challenge. They must commit to fully funding public schools within the life of the next National Education Reform Agreement. Thank you. And I'm now going to put Trevor back on full screen. And I think Trevor is going to make a few more remarks and then we can have some questions. Go ahead, Trevor.
Okay, thanks very much for doing that, Alan. Just the final thing I'd like to add to what's been said is that the next 9 months are going to be a critical time for public schools in Victoria and elsewhere in Australia. The new National Schools Reform Agreement between the Commonwealth and the states must be finalised by mid-2024 to operate from 2025 to 2028. It will involve bilateral funding agreements to be negotiated between governments, and that'll set the funding levels for public schools for the next or until 2028. Public school teacher, parent, principal organisations have a big job to do in terms of lobbying for a better funding deal. This requires inundating governments, politicians, newspapers, and other media sources with the case for a better funding deal. And as I say, it is going to be a really critical time, and I hope that what I've presented today will help you in this task. Thank you, and I'm happy to take some questions as best I can.
Thanks, Trevor. That was, I think you certainly delivered on my request with the paper, and we will make the paper available to people because that's what Trevor intended to do. So, Trevor, you're happy for us to circulate that to the people in this room and wider?
Yes, I'm very happy. That's what I was hoping to do.
And even more importantly, I think it would be a very timely for Parents Victoria to include that information to the new Minister of Education in Victoria and to the new Premier, as well as also to Jason Clare, because we will lobby with our national representative body of ACSO as well, because obviously they'll be doing this at the national level. We have a representative on the reference group. The AU have Meredith Peace and ACSO has Di Giblin on the reference group, Trevor. And so making sure they're equipped with that information will be helpful too. So now we're just going to throw to the floor to see if there's any questions, because we just wanted people to, a lot in the media and how things are reported and all the white noise around the funding often confuses parents and carers about how our system works, how it's funded, not just state-based, but how that national funding actually plays out and who's responsible for what. So thank you for giving all that clarification, Trevor. And we've got someone with their hand up and I'll throw to them. The question?
Yeah. Hi, Trevor. Thank you for the information. What I want to know is like through the public school system, we have to order all our financials to the government, but through the private school sector, why is it that they don't have to do that?
So the accountability, Trevor. is the question around
Yeah.
why public schools more accountable.
To be fair, I certainly don't know what they have to, I'm afraid I don't know what they have to give to the Victorian government. But as you see, the Victorian government funding is a very small part of their overall funding from government. They certainly have to produce audited statements to the Commonwealth Department of Education. The Commonwealth Department of Education is pretty slack in checking all those, and there have been successive, 2 or 3 Auditor General's reports, that is the National Audit Office, criticising the failure of the Commonwealth Government to effectively make private schools accountable for the funding, for how they use the funding. But having said that, they have taken steps in the last year or so to try and make how private schools use that funding more transparent. But we've yet to see the detail of all that. So, yes, the accountability has been really bad over the last 15 years or so. They say they've made some steps to increase transparency, but we've yet to see the outcome of that.
Especially when they're using taxpayers' money. The other thing I want to point out too is like these private and independent schools, if you look into them, every single one of those schools are a registered charity.
That's right.
That's right. So at no time as a taxpayer have I ever been asked, would you like your taxpayer money to go to a registered charity? Like, are you serious? I just cannot believe that the government allows this. Are they rorting the system themselves?
Well, they are tax exempt as charities, and one of the
charity is formed to help those people in need. That is why a charity is formed, to help those people in need. So how is it that the government is giving those charity schools so much money and then asking parents to add thousands of dollars on top of those fees? And yet our public school kids, hey, look at them.
Yeah, no, you're exactly. No, I don't have. You're exactly right.
Yeah,
the case regarding them as.
So we should not refer to them as private or independent schools. We should refer to them as charity schools, because that's how they are registered, as charity schools.
So this could be part, Trevor. We're going to go into a roadworks session after this segment, but thank you, Marissa, for that amplification of how things, the guise of how things are presented to the public. And I think this is where we have a role to play in having these conversations to unpack so people have an understanding.
People want to vomit how much the government is giving charity schools.
Yeah. So, Trevor, I don't know how, are you hearing this okay? The question yeah, beautiful. Any other questions from the floor? Yep, Tatiana.
Just bear with me one moment.
We've got someone running around the room with a mic.
Thanks for your stats, Trevor. That hurt my brain a little. So I look forward to reading the paper when I can. I'm here as a parent, so very new to this space, and my children go to government school, and I went to government school. And so excuse my ignorance, but I would really appreciate your view if you could share on, I guess, the why is it that government funds in the way it does? Like, is it a political, political based in terms of, they obviously campaign for funds for their own, for their own parties to be elected, and is it, based on that or something else? I guess just to be interested in your thoughts.
So providing some insights, Trevor, from your perspective.
Well, I mean, I think the history of school funding in Australia in the last, let's go back to the mid-1970s, is that private schools, particularly the Catholic system, but certainly the other independent associations are a powerful voice in government. They're a powerful voice in the coalition, and they are a powerful voice in the Labor Party. And they've been highly successful in their lobbying campaigns. The classic thing is that a Catholic school principal, when there's a threat to anyone's threatening their funding, they can put out newsletters to their parent community and get their parents to lobby their local politicians and write letters to the newspapers. But if a public school principal does something like that, they're likely to get sacked. And that's one of the disadvantages we have as a public system. And it points to the importance of organisations such as yourself and such as the P&C Council I've been long associated with in Canberra, the importance of organised work on the ground. And it's not easy, I know that. I know it personally, how hard it is. But that is the job we have to do. We have to lobby, we have to campaign, we have to inundate politicians with the information about our system. Because that's what private school organisations have been doing for the last 50 years.
And just recently we've had the experience with the proposed tax that which the Victorian government did back down on a number of independent schools on, the big tax exemption decision. And so, like you're saying, Trevor, this is where we as an organisation and our membership and our supporters need to really consider this is now time, as you say, because we've only got 9 months for this agreement to be reset for the next 4 or 5 years, is a call to action. Because, again, as said earlier, and I'm not trying to predispose, but people need to be thinking about this when we talk about what is the next thing in this space. Trevor, we've also got a representative from the AU here with the Every Child campaign. And so, again, that's another mechanism we can sign things and make sure we're informed and express that through to government, our dissatisfaction about our children in public schools have the same right of every other child in Victoria. Tuba?
Oh, I was just going to add on to your comment that it's time for us to all understand that schools are doing whatever is in their capacity. Yeah. And that's the biggest message that needs to be put out there from our end also, that whatever resources the schools have, they're trying their best. So it's a good time to put the trust in the schools and probably put your hands together along with them, join the team, and then lobby louder. Yeah.
So we had Andrew Dalgleish here from the Victorian Primary Principals Association as well, Trevor, and we also had, obviously, Meredith was here from the AU Vic branch. We had Mark McClay from Country Education Partnership. We had an initial discussion around school funding just before lunch. And, yeah, we're all, as a collective, we need to, as Tuba just described then, it's how we work together to combat this, to shift these decisions going forward in favour of public schools. Any further comment from you, Trevor, before I ask if there's any more questions?
No. I can only agree with you that it is important in terms of coalition building to present a united voice about the state of funding. But it's not, it can't just rely on peak organisations because, as you know, their resources are pretty limited. It does involve people in schools, whether it's teachers, the principals, or the parents, doing something at that level as well. And that means talking to local politicians, hassling them. Yeah, really hassling them.
Yeah, because they're our local members, they're our members of parliament, and that's their job, to be listening to their constituents. And the other part of it too is also music to your ears, is the Victorian Student Representative Council organisation, Victoria, which represents both government and non-government students, but they actually put up as a priority in their recent Congress, they've just come off it in September, about resourcing in schools. So even the students themselves from across both sectors recognise this is an issue.
Yeah, that's great.
So again, there's a number of people that we've got more allies than we have enemies. It is more about how we motivate and mobilise the Victorian population and the Australian population in relation to funding public schools. Anyone
Yes.
else like to make a comment, add anything, Sharon? Microphone's going to Sharon, who is also on the Parents Victoria Board, but she's also the chair and president of AXO.
Yeah, but I'm not speaking on behalf of AXO today, but I did want to say this SRS that we are in Victoria getting 80 whatever % of, close to 90, but not really, when you actually do the maths, that is the minimum agreed standard to provide a comprehensive curriculum and education for kids in our country. So we're not even anywhere near the minimum standard. I would think if you're going to call yourself the education state, then you should be funding it at 120% of what it takes so that every child actually gets a really decent education in our public system. So it's time for governments, both levels, to have a look at the funding model and whether they want to keep overfunding some schools and desperately underfunding others. So that's a decision for them to make. I think we know what they're going to decide, but it doesn't mean that we can't keep hassling them. As Trevor has said, we need to really just be in their face. I think the time has come. So, yeah, I just want to make that point that that's the minimum requirement and they're still not meeting anywhere near the minimum.
Thanks, Sharon. Trevor, any final words and then we'll wrap it up?
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, just one final thing, because, I mean, what happens when you do this lobbying and people can get blindsided by it is that the politicians and the governments are good at saying, oh, look, we're increasing funding, and they all are in nominal terms. But the critical thing is how much funding is increasing compared with costs. If, for example, you increase the wages of teachers, it doesn't mean there's more resources in the school. The same number of teachers are still there. And that's why you have to rely on the inflation-adjusted figures, because that tells you how much the real resources in schools are changing. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, because politicians are really good at saying, oh, yeah, we're increasing funding. But if they're not increasing funding in relation to the cost increases, they're actually cutting resources.
Yeah.